Okay. Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Shelly Goehring, and I'm part of the community assistance team at MHP, the Municipal Housing Partnership. And I am here with Kristen Guichard, who is going to help me with this, in fact, because she has really tangible, practical experience managing programs. But our topic tonight is developing and running housing programs. And this is a joint session with two communities, Abington and Reading, who have expressed an interest in this, in learning more about this area of housing, affordable housing. So for those of you who may not be as familiar, MHP is a quasi-state or a public nonprofit organization, and we're really focused on increasing access to affordable housing across the state. We have four main outward-facing teams. We have the Center for Housing Data, a small group of people who are collecting, analyzing, and sharing data to help inform housing policy on the local, regional, and state level. They've also put together a lot of really fantastic online resources that are available to anyone. My team is community assistance, and we are really about helping to build the local capacity to support affordable housing. We also work with housing authorities as well as nonprofit developers. We have a lending team that has lent over $1.4 billion for the creation and preservation of over 27,000 units of affordable rental housing. And then we have a homeownership team that is trying to increase the ability for low and moderate income households to access homeownership in Massachusetts. Tonight, we're going to I'm just going to give a brief overview of programs and the question around funding housing programs. And then Kristen's going to dig in to help walk through a lot of the practical kind of questions and the things that we need to be considering from a program administration perspective, creating guidelines, applications, and then how we distribute funds when we're running housing programs. And then she's going to provide a couple case studies looking at a couple different programs in two different communities. We're going to stop at each, we're going to pause at the end of each section ask if there are any questions. If there's something that, if we're using acronyms or if there's something that you need to ask the question quickly, then you can feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. We're happy to stop it. It can be a little bit informal that way. So just to get us started, in my work with communities that have affordable housing trust funds, I've sat in many meetings with trusts, and the idea of creating a housing program comes up. And sometimes it's expressed in a way of thinking that maybe it's a short win or something to do quickly or in the interim. And what I wanted to start with is to talk about this, of whether a program, creating a housing program, really is something to do quickly. And the reality is that putting together an effective housing program really is something that takes time to build. We really want to make sure that we're thoughtful about it as we're working with people who are in need, and our resources are oftentimes limited. So we really like communities to start with thinking about what does a particular program that you're thinking about, that you're interested in, is it meeting an identified need in your community? So is there something that came out of your housing production plan or housing needs analysis where there's a gap that's program focused, not just creating new housing, but program focused? To really start there with data that shows that there's a need. And then with some of our housing programs, we may require the funds to be paid back. Sometimes they're forgivable loans. Maybe it's forgiven over 5 or 10 years, but if the house, for example, in down payment assistance, if the house is sold earlier before the 5 years, then maybe a portion of the funds are returned to the program so then they can be reused again. Or sometimes when the house is sold, then the investment, the grant, it actually is expected to be repaid. So there could be funds that are generated down the road to help sustain the program, but those funds it's uncertain. We don't know when that's going to happen. So even if you do have a program that's written in, it could take time to receive funds back, which just brings up the question of what is your funding source? How much money do you have? And is it going to be a source that you can dip into over multiple years, or is it just a finite amount of money? And then lastly, we really want to think about long-term management of our programs. I just had a community last week reach out to me saying that they're having trouble with the person who's been running their program, and they're trying to find other options, and they're looking at different possibilities. So you really want to think about who's going to be able to have the capacity to run the program for the length of time that you want to support the program. Around funding, one of the biggest things is, of course, finding the funding. And then two is that funding sources typically have limitations, either how they're used, what kinds of programs they can be used for, the income level, the area median income that the funds can serve. So you want to think about not only your funding sources, the possible funding sources, but any limitations that they might have. And then, is it a renewable source? So if you're wanting to access Community Preservation Act funding for some kind of program that you believe is allowable under CPA, is it one amount, $300,000 and that's it? Or is it possible that you could go back once those funds are used to access more funds? So you just want to think about that as you're developing the program. It could inform how you structure the program or whether you even move forward at all. And then you want to think about, is it a program where you're going to require an affordability restriction? Or does your funding source require an affordability restriction? If you are thinking about CPA funds, then there are different opinions about whether a restriction is required or not. And we can talk about that more at some follow-up and provide you just with some opinions that the Department of Revenue has given on that topic. But just something else you want to think about. Do you want to require a restriction? Does your funding source potentially require that? And then as you're developing this kind of a program, we would always advise that you would consult with your town council to make sure that the way that you're structuring it, that it fits within the whatever are applicable laws, and that the town council is comfortable with how you're structuring the program. And then this is a framework that I use actually with trusts just to help them create goals and strategies for themselves as a board. But I just wanted to put it out there that if you are thinking seriously about a program, that it's having some kind of structure like this to think it through might be useful, of starting with what is the goal of your program? What are you trying to accomplish? And to try to create it, think about that in a measurable way. And then thinking about the potential strategies or what is it going to take to get to that goal, and then drilling down into some tasks as you're kind of organizing your work. And Kristen's gonna give you much more information digging into the specifics. So I think unless there are questions just getting us started, then I'm just going to have Kristen take it away.
Great. Yeah. So we're going to get into some, were there any questions? Sorry, before I jump in. No. Okay. So yeah, we'll get into some broad aspects of program administration and some of the foundational decisions that communities should consider. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So before launching any affordable housing program, one of the most important early decisions is determining who will administer the program, right? So how is that administration going to function on a day-to-day basis? And communities should carefully evaluate, I would say, whether the program is best managed internally by municipal staff that you already have, or maybe staff that you want to hire, or through an outside consultant, or maybe a regional partner might be able to assist. But there's really no one-size-fits-all approach. The right structure often depends on the scale of the program, available staff capacity, and the level of technical expertise really within that existing staff, and also constraints on, existing municipal budgets. Affordable housing programs can involve ongoing communications with applicants sometimes that I think can be overlooked. So just when someone submits an application, it's really never clear and black and white. And there are some applications that come through that are very simple, but oftentimes there is a lot of back and forth with applicants having questions or nuances. And, it's important to make sure that you have the staff that is able to look at income certifications, monitoring deadlines, and having that coordination between state and federal requirements that may be necessary depending on your funding source. And all of that can take up a lot of time. Even when, again, the process may appear to be simple, there's always these little nuances or unexpected situations that arise. So municipalities should also assess whether that existing staff has the time. And again, that specialized knowledge needed to manage those responsibilities effectively. The other thing to really keep in mind is that financial tracking and reporting is another critical component. So public funds, as we all know, require clear, accountable procedures, documentation, and transparency. And communities need to make sure they have systems in place to track expenditures, maintain accurate records, and prepare any required reporting for funding sources, boards, or auditors. And compliance, record keeping is really important. I think affordable housing programs often include income eligibility requirements, as we know, and monitoring obligations depending on that funding source. And maintaining those records to ensure continued compliance really helps both the municipality and the program participants over time. So sometimes there may be programs that have like a lifetime cap. And so you also want to make sure that you're tracking that, because if it's a successful program running, on over 10 years, you want to make sure you can have that look back. And then establishing foundational administrative decisions, early, I think is a key component. You want to make sure that these things are being thought of and solidified early to help create that clear and consistent program. Next slide. So other foundational considerations when establishing new programs is determining how you're going to deal with sensitive applicant information. So these programs often require applicants to submit detailed financial income documentation like tax returns, maybe pay stubs, bank statements, other personal records, maybe a copy of their driver's license. And so because these sensitive pieces of information, we really want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we are clear to the applicants on how we're going to keep them private, and be clear in the procedures ahead of time on how you're going to collect that information, review it, store it, who has access to it, who is reviewing it, and making sure all that information is determined ahead of time, and that you have the capability to do that. So these pieces shouldn't be, underestimated. I think they're important for the success of the program, because you want to make sure people feel comfortable applying too. And as we mentioned previously, depending on the funding source, such as HUD programs or maybe other federal state funding streams, there may be more rigorous compliance requirements. And that may have additional technical standards that have to be followed. So this includes reviewing income eligibility in accordance with program rules. Again, understanding that you're applying for funding and there may be restrictions like long-term affordability requirements, adhering to fair housing laws, and making sure that you have the capability to do that. And these can be, sometimes I think heavy technical things that seem simple, but again, they are quite technical. A lot of documentation heavy if you're dealing with federal or state funding as well. And the other thing I just wanted to mention was, depending on whether or not a community needs outside assistance with consultant services, it's good to make sure that your community knows in advance how to comply with procurement laws. If you're planning to contract outside, there are some already approved state vendors, so that's something to consider, but you want to make sure that you talk to your procurement officer or whoever in your community is in charge of those functions. So thinking through these operational and legal considerations at the beginning is, I think, some key things that are helpful to create a program that's, both professional, secure, and well positioned for long-term success. And then next slide, please. So some behind the scenes, let's think of like some effective program administration. I think it really relies on establishing clear internal processes, because it helps to ensure that consistency, accountability, and compliance right from the start to the finish. And this begins with applicant intake and review, where you have that staff or administrators, whoever you're using, inside or maybe consultants, who are receiving the applications. They're confirming completeness and organizing submissions for evaluation. And then from there, eligibility and income information, and verification is conducted, really to ensure those applicants are going to meet the program requirements. That often involves reviewing that documentation that we discussed and applying those specific program guidelines. Or, maybe when funds are limited, the approval or selection process may become even more important because in these cases, the community needs to decide how to prioritize applications. So ensuring equitable decision making and how documenting how selections are made, but also making that clear up front. So once eligibility is confirmed and selections are made, the process typically moves into some form of an award approval and payment process. So this step typically includes that internal review or authorization procedures, again, review of documentation of decisions, how the decision was made, and then coordination of the fund distribution. So that's going to really vary depending on the type of program. But you want to make sure that you have that strong financial management in place to make sure that those funds are being tracked, recorded, and transparent. And finally, ongoing compliance monitoring and file maintenance is really essential. And this includes tracking program requirements over time. So I mentioned if there are some lifetime caps, for example, and making sure to, again, hold on to those records for any auditing or reporting purposes, especially if you're dealing with the federal funds. So that's really some of the backbone processes of, well-managed compliant housing programs. And then we can move to the next slide. So some other, behind the scenes pieces that include program oversight and I'd say, strong reporting has to do with making sure that you are meeting your goals. So the report, to maybe a housing trust would be important to track how the funding commitments are being made and helping those individuals to determine if the program's working well and making sure that you can make any adjustments if you don't think that it's meeting the intended goal. So you want to make sure that you have the staff available to also kind of collect, do overviews, and report back to you if the trust is having staff assist or outside consultants assist with the program. And then, the trust, if they're planning to do any portion of it on their own, they would want to make sure that they're also doing some form of reporting out to the broader community to let them know how it's working. And then equally important is the reporting out on the expenditures and making sure that you're maintaining that oversight. And the other piece I wanted to mention too, and I don't want to overstate the reporting because I think the outreach is just as important, but they can sometimes, I think, go hand in hand. But it's really important to make sure that your community has the capacity to do the community outreach to ensure that information about your program is effectively being communicated to the population that you're trying to reach and the broader community, because obviously you want to get as many applications as possible so you can serve the greatest need, but also to make sure that the community knows the great work that's being done so that funding can be supported. If a program's being funded by CPA funds, you want to make sure that people know the work that's being done so that they go to town meeting and advocate for more funding if you're asking for it. And then next slide. Thank you. So we're going to get into some kind of establishment of clear guidelines. So we can move right on to the next slide too, if you don't mind.
And if I just pause and ask if there are if
Yes.
anyone has any questions
Please.
for the first section yet? Anyone want to unmute yourself and just ask a question? Feel free. Nope. Okay.
Okay, great. So when developing, affordable housing programs, whether it's a small grant program for like capital improvements for home ownership units, rental assistance or down payment assistance, it's essential to begin with those clear and consistent program guidelines. These guidelines help to ensure that fairness, that transparency, and effective use of those limited, often limited, right, public resources. So first, we want to make sure that we're clearly defining the purpose of the program. So this means being explicit about what the housing need is and what is trying to be addressed. So, looking toward that housing production plan or any other housing studies that you've been doing to determine what the need is. And then looking at how are you supporting those households that are at risk? Are you supporting households at risk of losing housing stability? Are you helping first-time homebuyers achieve homeownership? Or are you preserving affordability for existing homeowners? So along with that, we want to make sure that we're identifying that target population, including income levels, household types, and those specific community needs. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're defining the type of assistance being provided, such as direct financial assistance, is it gap funding, or reimbursement-based grants, or a direct grant. Having this clarity upfront ensures that the program is going to be designed and focused and be impactful and measurable. I think there's a question that popped up. Templates available. Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about that maybe, Shelly, when we get into some of the case studies.
That'd be great.
Does that
Yep,
sound
that'd be
good?
great. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so there's I think a lot of different components that you want to be thinking about. And some of these pieces that you're going to want to be measuring is, again, how impactful are the program, right? So the other piece that we want to make sure is to establish those clear eligibility requirements. So this typically includes setting income limits based on area median income, AMI, but it also might include additional criteria such as residency requirements, owner occupancy rules, or asset limitations, depending on the program goals. And eligibility criteria should be specific enough to ensure equitable access, but also aligning with the program's intent so that assistance reaches households that it's really designed to serve. And third, the important piece about defining, the application and documentation requirements. So this step ensures that there's consistency and compliance in how applications are reviewed. So I think this piece, again, a lot of these components may seem simple, but you want to make sure that you're really thinking about what program you have, what the funding sources are, and what documentation you need to adequately verify the requirements. So common documentation through some of these programs includes income verification. Again, we talked about pay stubs, tax returns, proof of identity, and residency and housing related documents such as leases, maybe mortgage statements or purchase and sales agreements, again, depending on the program type. So you want to make sure that whoever's working on those reviews is familiar with those documents and knows how to read them and understand them. So sometimes that can be aided by having, clear checklists to help reduce confusion, but also you want to make sure that people have those technical skills. So overall, strong program guidelines, eligibility standards, and documentation requirements really form that foundation of a well-run affordable housing program. And then we can move to the next slide. So some other key components that are essential to ensure fairness, consistency, and effective administration. The first one I wanted to touch on is the transparent selection process. So it's important to clearly define how households will be selected. This may include a first come, first serve model, maybe a lottery system, when demand maybe exceeds available funding and you only have a certain amount to go so far. Or the use of priority categories, sorry. We talked a little bit about, local residency, but maybe there's some vulnerability factors that you want to consider. And in some cases, wait list structures may also be appropriate to manage overflow applications in like a more fair and predictable way. So wait lists kind of are a whole other different topic, but those can be structured in different ways. And it's it's something to consider again, if you want to maintain an active list of applicants. Um, and second, it's important to make sure that there's accessibility and equity that's built into the program design. So considering things like language access, digital access, or complexity of the application process in and of itself. Like, do you have staff that is available to sit down with someone if they're having difficulties with understanding the application? English might not be their second language, but English proficiency ranges. And equity also means ensuring that the program design does not unintentionally exclude eligible households, and that outreach and supports built into the process so that all qualified applicants have a fair opportunity to apply. So being thoughtful about like where those notifications are going out, we kind of talked about that before, but making sure that you're really trying to advertise where you expect to find the target population, but then also more broad and in a general way as well. And then third, making sure to develop that consistent administration process. So thinking again about how you're standardizing the applications and the review process. If you have a couple people doing the reviews, you just want to make sure that it's always the same and that decisions are always made the same and approvals are documented in the same way. We can move to the next slide about application process.
So first, let's just pause. Do we have any
Yeah.
questions at this point?
Not a question, but if you don't have a consultant, are there tools to help like the trust fund or staff keep up to date in terms of how to calculate and determine maximum rents or income allowances? Like how do you try to stay up to date with the different numbers and the metrics that are applied?
I think that's a great question. I think it really gets into who is going to administer the program. You want to make sure that the person that's administering knows how to do that. I don't
Hmm.
think I mean, unless Shelly is aware of, a particular resource, but these are things that all interplay together. For example, like the HUD income limits just came out May 1st, and the Regional Housing Services Office administers programs like this for about 6 communities, or we have a full 10 set of communities, but primarily there are 6 that have programs like this. And, we're quickly updating all of the forms whenever there are changes being made. And we have people on staff that are certified occupancy specialists. And so they're very well informed about how to do um, that type of work that you're talking about, making sure that you're calculating utilities and to rent and understanding all of those requirements. So I don't think there's necessarily like a one-shot um, resource necessarily. Would you
It's
say
a very
that, Shelley?
specialized.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so from MHP's perspective, we really encourage communities to not have a volunteer board manage a program like this. And so if you don't have the municipal capacity to do it, where during the pandemic, we had many communities create an emergency rent assistance program.
Hmm.
And there were some communities like a Waltham where they already had a community development department, they had capacity, they already ran programs, so they were able to create this new program. But in most cases, the communities outsourced it. They hired a nonprofit entity, a housing entity that already had some knowledge and some understanding of how to run programs. So it's why we're repeating kind of multiple times of why it's really important to think about upfront who's going to run it and who has the capacity to run it, not just for the first 6 months or for the first year, but if you want it to be multiple years, is it an entity or a person, a consultant that can do that?
Hmm.
Great question.
This is what's been recommended for us to do in Abington. As we get the programs in place, we have a appointed board by the selectmen, but we've been recommended to hire someone to administer these programs.
Yeah, I hope like one day we could expand our regional housing consultant contract and maybe potentially look at programs like this and work with them.
Yes, that would be really fantastic. It would make them probably the most sense for your area.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Great question. So we could probably move on to the next slide, Shelley. So talking a little bit, getting into the details of application processes. Um, and this one back, I think, outreach and strategy. So I love talking about outreach. So I'm a one forward. I think one more slide forward, Shelly.
Is the order off?
Outreach and strategy is perfect. Yes, that's right. Yep.
Okay.
Oop, I think it skipped ahead again for some reason. I don't know why it keeps. There we go. Yeah, right there. So outreach strategies. So I think this is kind of like a fun thing to talk about. I always like to think about how to get community members involved, how to get information out there to the public. So I think it's one of those things that I mentioned again before, but well-designed programs only work if residents know about them and know that they exist. So you may have a great program, but if it's not being blasted out there, people won't know and they won't understand how to apply. So a strong outreach strategy, uses multiple channels and is really an important thing to remember. Municipal websites, they can serve as the primary resource for program information, applications, and deadlines. So that can be like your hosting place. And then social media and newsletters, those can really help to share updates quickly and reach that broad audience. And newspaper advertisements, I think they still remain important for reaching residents who might not be used to digital platforms. I think it's still an effective tool. I know that many people may not use them anymore, but I think there's still a population that does. And then partnerships with housing authorities, helping to target and reach income eligible households that are already connected to housing services, and utilizing other partnerships like school districts in getting information out to families. A lot of school districts have, weekly newsletters, and that's another group that could be, you know, uh, really reached in a more, I think, robust way. In addition to posting information on community bulletin boards and libraries, there are probably other different resources in your communities if you have connections with local religious leaders or people that are known in your community to have a voice or connect to others that people feel comfortable going to, making sure that information gets to them. So together with those outreach methods, ensuring that the programs are visible, accessible, and equitable, so that they're really trying to reduce barriers to the population that you're really trying to serve. And providing that clear and accessible information is really critical, I think, to administering any of these programs for the many reasons that I mentioned. And there's also the fact about making sure that people understand what the process is. So there may be certain programs that you want to hold an information session for. So before the application deadline, you may want to do a virtual information session on Zoom, for example, about what the application process is like, what to expect, documentation that's required, and what to expect once the deadline closes, and how the selection process is going to be made. So I think that's a helpful tool sometimes, again, depending on the program. And once we think about when applications are received, right, after maybe a lottery is held, I'm sorry, a either a workshop or information session is held. Once that deadline passes and you have all your applications, you might end up using different methods for review. So you might have, you know, various processes, and you want to make sure that, again, that fairness is being applied. The other part about fairness I wanted to touch on is local preference provisions. So there may be some programs that have local preference provisions, which prioritize applicants that have some tie to the community. Maybe they have residency or employment. When that's used, it's important to make sure that those preferences are carefully designed and implemented in a way that still aligns with fair housing goals. So this means ensuring that any local preference does not create unintended barriers for protected classes or limited equal access to opportunity. So overall, the goal is to be clear, communicative to a broad audience, transparent through the selection process, and making sure that you're being fair, consistent, and aligning with your local priorities for fair housing requirements. And then we can go to the next slide when we get into distributing payments. So finalizing awards and distributing payments are really going to vary depending on the type of program and the funding source. But there are several key considerations that remain, I would say, consistent across most programs. But it's important to recognize that depending on the funding source, that's going to impact the process. So for example, rental assistance programs, if the program's funded through with home funds, additional requirements might apply once the applicant's selected. So this might include a housing quality inspection of the unit prior to leasing or the lease approval or payment. In contrast, if there's a rental assistance program that's funded just through maybe local trust funds, the process might be more flexible, and you might not need to do that formal inspection. Formal inspections can be done by another consultant. So there's consultants out there that just do those types of inspections, and they have reports that they submit. Another example for a small grant or maybe capital assistance programs, once eligibility has been confirmed and awards are approved, the next step is typically to provide your formal award letters and then grant agreements that you would want signed both by the trust and the applicant. And those documents clearly outline the terms of the assistance, including eligibility eligible use of funds, project expectations, and conditions of compliance. So when the program is, for example, a capital improvement for, let's say, a roof replacement, it may say that you need to live in the home for a full year prior to selling. Otherwise, you may need to return the funds. In some cases, especially if there are those ongoing obligations or potential repayment conditions, you want to make sure that you have that reviewed by your town council to ensure, that legal clarity and enforceability. You want to make sure that you're not just kind of copy pasting another community necessarily, because sometimes every town council has a little bit of a different perspective, and they're ultimately representing you. And then finally, there's the distribution of funds. So that needs to be carefully structured as well and clearly documented. In most cases, payments are not made directly to the applicant. So instead, funds are typically issued directly to a vendor or a contractor, like that roofer, right? Or a landlord if it's rental assistance, or a closing attorney if it's first-time home buyer down payment assistance, for example. So again, depending on the program type, distribution of funds is going to look a little different, but in almost all cases, it doesn't go directly to the applicant. There are examples where there may be an exception. So some of the small grant or capital assistance programs that we help to administer have a provision that, if there's an emergency situation, let's say someone's furnace goes in the middle of winter and they need to replace it, obtaining 3 quotes and then waiting for the trust to meet with a quorum, that may not be possible for them. And so the trust in those cases may allow for a special consideration and allow for the funds to be reimbursed directly to the applicant. And then I think we're going to go into some case studies, but do you want to pause there quickly, Shelly?
Yep, just ask if there are any questions at this point.
Sure.
Feel free to unmute yourself. Nope, okay.
All right. Great. So we can go right into the first case study. So this example is a down payment or closing cost assistance in the town of Acton. So I want to highlight the Acton Affordable Housing committee, so ACHC is what they're called. They have this down payment and closing cost assistance program, which is funded through the Community Preservation Act. And this program is designed to help income eligible households overcome, I think, one of the most significant barriers to home ownership, sometimes upfront cost, closing costs, right? It's something that you need to make sure that you have in addition to everything else that you're trying to plan for. And it provides direct financial assistance that can be used towards that down payment and closing costs, helping those households bridge that gap between the available savings and the cost of purchasing the home in a high cost market like Acton. So I think it's been successful. There's been a bit of I'd say a couple years. The last 2 years, there haven't been many applicants, but there hasn't been as much outreach in the last 2 years. But a key feature of this program is that CPA funds are provided as a grant. So this means there's no lien placed on the property and no repayment is required, which makes the assistance more accessible and less burdensome for qualifying households. I think it's also a little bit easier to administer. The program is structured with very clear eligibility requirements. It's based off of 80% AMI for household income limit and a household asset limit of $275,000, but $75,000 for age-restricted households. So there's a nuance, a difference there. And these standards are ensuring that CPA resources are directed to households that qualify financially and are contributing to the long-term community stability. From an administrative standpoint, the application process requires standard documentation, such as income verification for all household members that are eligible, tax returns, pay stubs, and the purchase and sales agreement. And this documentation supports that, again, that consistent review and ensures the compliance with the program guidelines. And importantly, the program's designed to align with real-world closing timelines. So once an application is approved, funds are issued by the Housing Trust to provide a check directly payable to the closing attorney to ensure that the assistance is properly applied at the time of closing and really integrated smoothly into that real estate transaction. So overall, I think this program demonstrates how CPA-funded housing assistance can be structured in a way that's transparent, administratively workable, and impactful, and supporting that home ownership without adding a long-term financial burden to the recipient.
So can I just jump in that MHP, just so folks know, and I'll send the link to you as soon as it becomes live, but MHP has been working on creating guidelines for municipalities who are interested in creating a down payment assistance program. And it's in the final editing, so hopefully it'll be available soon, but it goes through in a lot of detail around down payment assistance programs. Some do add a lien and require some repayment, so they're structured differently. But I'll make sure I get the link to both of your communities when that becomes live.
That sounds awesome.
I just have one question, Kristen. For the total assets, is that like a standard value based on AMI, or is that like how did you determine that threshold for total assets?
That's a very good question. I don't know how they determined that at the time, like why they selected that. The program was created almost 10 years ago, but I can look into the history of the program and find out for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just read. No.
Oftentimes with housing programs, the asset limit is high. What's allowed is higher for seniors than it is for people who are under, say, 62 years old. And there are some limits that are just somewhat standard in housing programs, so it might have been borrowed from that.
Yeah, I think the 75,000 is a standard that we see for a lot of even in like LIP program for local initiative program for home ownership units for, if you're applying for purchasing a unit, for example, the 275,000, I can't recall right now. So, but I know 75,000 is definitely a standard.
Oftentimes common, yeah.
Yeah.
Only on that, is that assets after the down payment? Say they are putting 20,000 to down payment, or is it assets before typically?
It's their total assets, so it would include what they're putting down too.
At the time of, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't have a specific case study for a small grant or capital assistance program, but I thought it would be interesting just to show this slide because these are 6 communities within the Regional Housing Services Office service area that we assist with, and they all vary slightly in terms of the amount of money that they provide, the funding source that they use, and restrictions that they may have for applicant income, AMI, maximum income, or their grant cycles. And so it's all a little bit different, but it might just be interesting to take a look at. But they are typically, one-time or limited grants. So there's usually a maximum lifetime cap, and therefore necessary repairs or capital improvements. So common eligible uses are for like roof replacements, heating systems, structural repairs, accessibility modifications, or other health and safety related improvements. A lot of these improvements also relate closely to those items that an individual could apply for to you know, basically well, let me rephrase that. So it's if you think about the items to make sure that that unit is going to be livable and safe, and it's going to be maintained in your community as an affordable housing asset. So it's used by some communities to make sure that the next affordable homeowner is not going to have to put in a lot of work to maintain it because it's very challenging for a resale when you have first-time home buyer requirements and there's a lot of capital improvements that need to be done. So that creates a really challenging situation. So there's that side to it, but I think the small grant programs are also helpful for the individual homeowners that are living there at the time as well to make sure that they can stay in the community and afford to live where they are. But this is just a kind of overview of some different ways how communities have implemented and made those decisions, those foundational decisions in different ways. And are there any questions about, I know I didn't kind of go into great detail about that, but so we could move on then to the next case study. So the next case study, we can move to the next slide too. So next I want to highlight the town of Bedford's tenant-based rental assistance program, or we say TBRA, as another example of how program design is shaped by funding source and program requirements. Unlike locally funded rental assistance programs, I kind of alluded to this before. So Bedford's TBRA program is funded through home funds, which come with federal compliance requirements that directly influence how the program is administered. Because of this funding source, the program has to meet additional standards related to eligibility, housing quality, and cost reasonableness. So one of the key administrative features of this program is that due to limited funding availability, a lottery process was used to select participants. So when demand exceeds those available resources, the lottery can provide for, a fair and transparent method of selection. Sometimes first come, first serve may not really allow for as fair of a selection process. So that allows for the eligible applicants an equal opportunity to be served. It's not just those that saw it first, or maybe those that are more web savvy and saw it while they were browsing the town's website. Kind of puts people more on a equal playing field. So under this particular program, they are providing 12 months of tenant assistance, and it establishes that clear timeline. So some programs, that's a consideration a community could make. Maybe it's only 6 months and you want to try to assist more individuals, but only for a shorter period of time. But in this case, 12 months was determined, which I think is probably the best way to go. So that defined period really helps to balance the goal of providing that meaningful housing stability, I think, while also ensuring that the limited funding resources can be distributed among those households in need over time. The other important requirement under the home TBRA program that Bedford is working with is the rent reasonableness standards. So this means that the rent for any assisted unit has to be evaluated to ensure that it's reasonable compared to similar units in the local market and does not exceed the fair market rent threshold without justification. So this really safeguards, to make sure that public funds aren't being used to subsidize rents that are excessively high relative to the broader housing market. I think it can be a challenge though sometimes because I think rents are just going up a lot. So, but that is something, again, making sure that you're taking into consideration the type of funding program because that may not be something that a community wants to consider if they're doing a local program, or they may have some more flexibility on what they classify as rent reasonableness. In addition to that, the program also requires housing quality inspection. So I mentioned that before. This is a key distinction from locally funded programs. So the town of Maynard has a rental assistance program, but does not require the housing quality inspections. It requires the applicant to certify certain things, but it does not require that level of inspection or rent testing. So eligibility still includes standard income verification and lease documentation here for the Bedford program, but the administrative process is more structured due to that federal oversight requirement. So overall, the Bedford TBR program, I think, demonstrates a good example of how federal home funds can help, help with these programs. And one exciting piece that I think, Shelly, I'm not sure if I mentioned to you, but we're working with the RHSO communities that are within the home consortium on creating a regional TBRA program. So we may have more information to share on how that program kicks off. But for now, I think this Bedford example is a good one as a case study. And I think that's about all for this one. So if you have any questions about that case study, I'd be happy to answer.
Any questions?
It'd probably be more Bedford specific questions, but like, right, like timing up the lease for a full 12 months and things and that administration process. I'm curious about too. If it's like an existing tenant who wanted to apply but had 6 months left on their lease, how they factor those things in and things.
That's a good question. So the lease is something that needs to be reviewed. And there's a couple of, I would say, like lessons learned in this too. So even when you're moving through a program that you may have done before, there is always little pieces that come up. And so I think it's helpful to have to be working with staff that have experience in that. Another question that came up for this program was whether or not somebody moves after receiving their rental assistance agreement. Can they transfer that to a new unit? And so that's something that we're going to be looking at for the regional program. So how to structure that in and how to make sure that it kind of stays with that individual, but also making sure like how do you move that continuity forward. So I think if someone had a like halfway through the year, you would be reviewing that lease and then also making sure that they have a lease for the next 6 months. So you want to make sure that you have documentation for whatever you're going to be paying and working with the landlord. Because if there's direct communication with the landlord and the landlord does sign paperwork as well for this type of program. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of communication in administering these types of programs.
Any other questions?
Is it safe to assume most of the reasonable rents listed are deed restricted affordable units, or at times are they market rate unrestricted units?
Yeah, they can be either or.
Hmm.
There's no restriction. I'd say that it's really um all over the place. I mean, if they're already restricted rents, um then with home funding there I'd have to get back to you on that, but I know that there are some restrictions on um almost like double dipping.
Right, they might not be paying more than
Yeah,
30%
so
loan.
I'd have to get back to you on the specifics of it, but I would say most of the rents they're the open market. They're not restricted.
So I'm going to wrap us up a little bit. One, thanking Kristen for sharing so much of her expertise, which goes beyond me. I haven't actually ran a housing program, so it's great to have someone who's had a lot of experience doing that to help support this. But kind of wrapping up, three things that we've said a lot about this that we're trying to really underline is that you really want to start by creating a program that's around an identified need in your community, whether that's your housing production plan or a needs analysis, but something that's kind of been documented as a gap or a need in the community. And then to really think about your funding source and the possible limitations of the funding source. And just a reminder that looking at what other communities do is fine. It's great. It can help you get ideas, but you just want to make sure that you do your own due diligence in your community, because just because another community does something, it doesn't necessarily make it the right way to use a funding source or a program. So just do your own due diligence. And then three, really think about the long-term management of the program, or at least for as long as you're wanting to run the program, to make sure that you're bringing someone on board who really has the capacity and the expertise to do that, so that it's not a burden on volunteers. We would never expect a volunteer board to really be the ones managing the day-to-day of a program. And then, of course, all the many other things that Kristen shared about putting together programs. And then, just for everyone's information, MHP has a lot of different online resources that are just free and available to anyone. And we always want to be a resource for you as well. I will send the PDF of these slides to Andrew, to both communities, and you can distribute those. We'll post this online, so you'll also be able to access it as well. I'm going to stop sharing and just see if there are any final questions that anyone would like to share, or comments.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to